A poor single man, jobless, with only 3 days left before being evicted from his apartment. A cold, disabled CEO living in a fortress-like mansion, and no one can work for her for more than 2 months. When his 6-year-old daughter cries, afraid to sleep in the car, Nolan Hayes reluctantly accepts a job as a live-in housekeeper, despite warnings that she will destroy him. But unexpectedly, sometimes the most broken people know how to heal each other. Follow my story to the end. Like and comment the city you're viewing to let me know how far this story has come. The eviction notice was taped to the door when Nolan got home. 3 days. That was all he had left. He stood in the hallway of the apartment building with the paper in his hand, reading the words over and over like they might change if he stared long enough. They didn't. The ink stayed black, the deadline stayed firm, and the knot in his chest pulled tighter. Behind the door he could hear Mia singing, some made-up song about a princess and a dragon. She always did that when she was coloring, her voice high and sweet and completely unaware that the world outside her crayons was falling apart. Nolan folded the notice and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He'd tell her later. Maybe. Or maybe he'd figure something out first so he wouldn't have to. He turned the knob and stepped inside. "Daddy!" Mia was on the floor, surrounded by an explosion of colored pencils and paper. Her dark curls were wild, her knees smudged with marker ink. She jumped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. "You're home!" "Yeah, baby, I'm home." He bent down and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the smell of strawberry shampoo and something sweet she must have eaten. "What are you drawing?" "A castle, with a really big tower and a garden with flowers that never die." "Sounds perfect." She grinned up at him, gap-toothed and proud. "It is." Nolan straightened and looked around the apartment. It wasn't much. One bedroom, a cramped kitchen, a bathroom where the tile was starting to crack. But it was theirs. Or it had been. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Half a carton of milk, some leftover pasta, a few yogurt cups that were probably expired. He shut the door and leaned against it, rubbing his face with both hands. 3 days. He'd been out of work for 2 months. The company he'd worked for went under without warning, and they didn't even give him severance. Just a handshake and a good luck. He'd burned through his savings in the first month. The second month, he'd borrowed from friends. Now there was nobody left to borrow from, and the rent was due. He'd applied to everything. Warehouses, retail, night shifts, day shifts, anything that would take him. But every place wanted someone younger, or someone with a degree, or someone who didn't have a kid to pick up from school every day at 3. And Mia. He couldn't think about what would happen to Mia if they ended up on the street. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his friend Eric. Check Craigslist. Live-in position. Good pay. Weird boss. Might be worth a shot. Nolan stared at the message. Live-in. That meant he wouldn't have to worry about rent. It also meant uprooting Mia, moving her somewhere unfamiliar, working for someone he didn't know. But 3 days didn't leave room for being picky. He opened the browser and found the listing. Live-in household assistant, immediate start, seeking responsible, discreet individual for full-time live-in position. Duties include household management, meal preparation, errands, and personal assistance as needed. Private quarters provided. Competitive salary. Must be flexible, patient, and professional. Previous applicants need not apply. The last line made him pause. Previous applicants need not apply. That was a red flag if he'd ever seen one. But the salary listed was more than he'd made in his last job, and the words private quarters meant Mia would have a place to sleep that wasn't the back seat of his car. He called the number. It rang twice before a woman answered. Her voice was clipped, efficient. Yes? Hi, I'm calling about the listing, the live-in position. Name. Nolan Hayes. There was a pause. He could hear typing in the background. Experience? I've worked in logistics for the past 8 years. I'm organized, I can cook, I'm good with schedules, and I've got a daughter, so I'm used to managing a household. A daughter? Yes, she's 6, quiet, well-behaved. She won't be any trouble. Another pause. Longer this time. The position requires someone who can start immediately, tomorrow, if possible. I can do that. The employer is particular. The last 3 assistants lasted less than 2 months. If you're not prepared to handle difficult working conditions, don't waste our time. Nolan glanced toward the living room where Mia was still humming to herself. I'm prepared. Fine. Be at this address tomorrow at 9. She rattled off a street name in a neighborhood Nolan had only driven through once. The kind of place where the houses had gates and the driveways were longer than his entire block. Bring your daughter if you must. Miss Arden will decide if you're suitable. The line went dead. Nolan lowered the phone and stared at it. Ms. Arden. He didn't recognize the name, but something about the way the woman had said it made it sound important, like he should have known who she was. He pulled up a search. The results loaded fast. Too fast. Celeste Arden, CEO. Arden Global Solutions. There were dozens of articles, business profiles, stock reports, a few older pieces about a car accident 3 years ago that had left her with severe spinal injuries. The photos showed a woman in her late 30s, sharp-featured and unsmiling, her hair pulled back tight. In every image, she looked like she could cut through steel with a glance. One headline stood out. Arden returns to work after months of recovery, refuses to discuss personal life. Nolan scrolled through a few more articles, then closed the browser. He didn't need to know her life story. He just needed the job. The next morning, he packed everything they owned into 2 duffel bags and the trunk of his car. Mia sat in the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit and asking questions. Where are we going? To meet someone. For a job. What kind of job? Helping someone run their house. Is it a big house? I think so. Will I have my own room? Nolan looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were wide, hopeful. Maybe, baby. We'll see. The drive took 30 minutes. The neighborhood changed gradually, the buildings getting newer, the streets getting cleaner, until finally they turned onto a private road lined with trees. At the end of it sat a house that looked more like a museum than a home. It was all glass and steel, sharp angles and clean lines, surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges and a lawn that looked like it had been cut with scissors. The driveway was wide enough to park 4 cars side by side. Nolan pulled up to the gate and pressed the intercom button. A voice crackled through, the same woman from the phone. Name? Nolan Hayes. The gate buzzed and swung open. He drove up slowly, feeling Mia's eyes on the house. Wow, she whispered. Yeah, Nolan muttered. Wow. He parked near the front steps and got out, then opened the back door for Mia. She climbed out, still holding her rabbit, her head tilted back as she stared up at the building. The front door opened before they reached it. The woman who stepped out was not Celeste Arden. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed either time. Mr. Hayes. That's me. Her gaze dropped to Mia, then back to him. Follow me. She led them inside. The interior was exactly what Nolan expected, and somehow worse. Everything was white, or gray, or glass. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. There were no family photos, no personal touches, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. It felt like walking into a showroom. They passed through a hallway and into a large room that overlooked the back of the property. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the yard, and in the center of the room, facing the glass, was a woman in a wheelchair, Celeste Arden. She didn't turn when they entered. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands resting on the armrests. Her hair was dark, pulled into a low bun, and she wore a black sweater that looked expensive enough to pay Nolan's rent for a month. Ms. Arden, the older woman said quietly. Mr. Hayes is here. Celeste turned her head, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes were gray, and they moved over Nolan and Mia with the precision of someone conducting an inspection. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just looked. Nolan felt Mia's hand tighten around his. Finally, Celeste's gaze settled on him. You brought a child. Yes, my daughter, Mia. I didn't agree to house a child. You didn't say I couldn't. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or curiosity. How old is she? 6? Does she go to school? Yes. Then she'll need to be enrolled. I assume you'll handle that. I will. Celeste's gaze shifted to Mia. "What's your name?" Mia hesitated, then stepped forward slightly. "Mia Hayes." "Do you always bring a stuffed animal with you, Mia Hayes?" Mia looked down at the rabbit in her arms, then back up. "Only Mr. Floppy. He's my best friend." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Celeste turned her chair to face the window again. "Mrs. Calloway will show you to your quarters. You start tonight. If you last a week, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement." Nolan opened his mouth to respond, but the older woman, Mrs. Calloway, was already gesturing for them to follow. He took Mia's hand and turned to leave. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped. Celeste still wasn't looking at him. "No one lasts in this house. If you're planning to quit, do it now and save us both the trouble." Nolan didn't hesitate. "I'm not planning to quit. They never are." He wanted to say something else, something that would prove he wasn't like the others, but he didn't know what that would be. So he just nodded and followed Mrs. Calloway out of the room. Their quarters were on the second floor, tucked into a wing that felt separate from the rest of the house. 2 rooms connected by a bathroom. One for him, one for Mia. The furniture was simple but clean, and the beds looked more comfortable than anything they'd slept on in the past year. Mia ran to the window in her room and pressed her face against the glass. "Daddy, look, there's a pool!" "Oh!" Nolan set the bags down and joined her. She was right. Below them, a long rectangular pool stretched across the yard, the water perfectly still. "Can I go swimming?" "We'll see." "That means no." "It means we'll see." Mia sighed dramatically and flopped onto the bed. "This place is weird." "Yeah," Nolan said quietly. "It is." Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway. "Miss Arden takes her meals at 7, noon, and 6. You'll prepare them and serve them in the dining room. She doesn't eat with company. You'll eat in the kitchen after she's finished. Groceries are delivered on Tuesdays and Fridays. There's a list of her dietary restrictions in the kitchen. Any questions?" Nolan had about 100. He went with the simplest. "What happened to the last person who worked here?" Mrs. Calloway's expression didn't change. "She quit, like the others." She turned to leave, then paused. "A word of advice, Mr. Hayes. Miss Arden doesn't tolerate pity or excuses or mistakes. If you want to survive here, remember that." She left before he could respond. Nolan stood in the doorway, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Then he turned and looked at Mia, who was already arranging her stuffed animals on the bed. "We're going to be okay, right, Daddy?" He crossed the room and sat beside her, pulling her into his lap. "Yeah, baby, we're going to be okay." He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he didn't have a choice. That night he prepared Celeste's dinner: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a side of quinoa. He followed the instructions on the list to the letter, plated everything carefully, and carried it to the dining room on a tray. Celeste was already seated at the head of the table. She didn't look up when he entered. Nolan set the plate in front of her and stepped back. She picked up her fork, cut a piece of the salmon, and tasted it. Chewed, swallowed, then she set the fork down. "It's under-seasoned." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I followed the list." "The list is a guideline. You're supposed to know how to cook." "I do know how to cook." "Then do it correctly." She pushed the plate away. "Take it back. Start over." He stared at her. She stared back, her expression flat and unreadable. Nolan picked up the plate and walked back to the kitchen. He dumped the food in the trash, pulled out more salmon, and started again. This time he added more salt, more pepper, a squeeze of lemon. He tasted it before he plated it, and it was fine. Better than fine. He brought it back to her. She took one bite, set down her fork. "Better. But the vegetables are overcooked." Nolan didn't say anything. He just picked up the plate and walked out. When he got back to the kitchen, Mia was sitting at the table, eating a peanut butter sandwich he'd made her earlier. She looked up at him. "Is she mean?" Nolan set the plate down harder than he meant to. "Yeah, she's mean." "Are we going to leave?" He looked at her big brown eyes and her hopeful face and the crumbs on her cheek, and he thought about the eviction notice and the empty bank account and the 3 days they'd had left. "No," he said. "We're not going to leave." Mia nodded and went back to her sandwich. Nolan made the vegetables again. Over the next week, Celeste found something wrong with everything he did. The floors weren't clean enough. The coffee was too weak. The mail wasn't sorted correctly. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She just pointed out every flaw with the same cold precision, like she was reading from a script. Nolan didn't quit. He fixed the floors, he made stronger coffee, he sorted the mail. And when she found something new to criticize, he fixed that too. At night, after Mia was asleep, he sat in his room and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. But every morning he got up and did it again, because he didn't have a choice. And because, somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd started to wonder if Celeste's cruelty was less about him and more about something else entirely. On the 8th day, he brought her breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit. She tasted the eggs and nodded. Acceptable. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't a criticism either. Nolan took it as a win. That afternoon, Mia came home from her new school and ran straight to the kitchen, her backpack bouncing. "Daddy, guess what?" "What?" "I made a friend. Her name is Emma, and she has a dog, and she says I can come to her house sometime." Nolan smiled despite himself. "That's great, baby. Can I go outside? I want to see the pool again." "Yeah, just stay where I can see you." She ran out the back door, her shoes slapping against the tile. Nolan was washing dishes when he heard the voice. Does she always have that much energy? He turned. Celeste was in the doorway, her wheelchair angled so she could see out into the yard. She was watching Mia, who was crouched by the edge of the pool, dragging her fingers through the water. "Pretty much," Nolan said. "It must be exhausting." "Sometimes." Celeste didn't respond. She just kept watching. After a moment, she wheeled herself back into the hallway and disappeared. Nolan dried his hands and looked out the window. Mia was laughing at something, her reflection rippling in the water. He didn't know what Celeste's problem was, but for the first time since they'd arrived, he thought maybe he could figure it out, if she let him. 2 weeks in, Nolan had learned the rhythm of the house. Celeste woke at 6. She spent the mornings in her office, taking calls and working on her laptop. She took lunch at noon, dinner at 6, and disappeared into her room by 8. She rarely spoke unless she had a complaint. She never smiled. And she never, ever talked about the accident. Nolan didn't ask. Mrs. Calloway had made it clear that personal questions were off limits, but he couldn't help noticing the things no one said out loud. The way Celeste's hands sometimes trembled when she transferred from her chair to the couch. The bottles of medication lined up in the bathroom cabinet. The fact that she never left the house. One night he was cleaning up after dinner when he heard a sound from the hallway. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a low, pained groan. He set down the dish he was holding and walked toward the sound. Celeste's door was ajar. Through the gap, he could see her sitting on the edge of her bed, her face twisted in pain. Her hands were gripping the mattress so hard her knuckles were white. Nolan hesitated. Then he knocked lightly. "You okay?" Her head snapped up. For a second, he saw something raw in her expression. Vulnerability, fear, exhaustion. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask she always wore. "Get out! You're hurt!" "I said get out. Let me help." "I don't need your help." Her voice cracked on the last word and she turned her face away. "Just leave me alone." Nolan stood there for a moment, unsure. Then he stepped back and pulled the door shut. But he didn't go far. He waited in the hallway, listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. He heard the faint creak of the bed, the rustle of blankets, then silence. He went back to the kitchen and finished the dishes. The next morning, Celeste didn't mention it. She ate her breakfast without a word, then wheeled herself into her office and shut the door. Nolan didn't bring it up either, but something had shifted. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to it, but it was there. A crack in the wall she'd built around herself. And he was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be alone as much as she pretended. Mia started spending more time in the common areas of the house. She'd sit in the living room with her coloring books, humming to herself, completely oblivious to the tension that seemed to fill every corner. Celeste would wheel past her, glance down at whatever she was drawing, and keep moving. But one day, Mia looked up. "Do you like dragons?" Celeste stopped. She didn't turn around. "What?" "Dragons. Do you like them? I'm drawing one. Want to see?" There was a long pause. Then Celeste reversed her chair and looked down at the paper. It was covered in bright colors, a lopsided dragon breathing what might have been fire, or maybe spaghetti. It was hard to tell. "It's very..." Celeste hesitated. "Colorful." Mia beamed. "Thanks. I'm going to put it on the fridge." We don't put things on the fridge. Oh, Mia's face fell. Okay. Celeste studied her for a moment. Then, without a word, she wheeled herself away. But the next morning, when Nolan opened the fridge, he saw it. Mia's drawing, held up by a single magnet. He didn't say anything. But when Celeste came into the kitchen for her coffee, he caught the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was regret. Either way, it was there. And Nolan started to realize that the woman everyone said was impossible might just be scared. Scared of being seen. Scared of being hurt. Scared of letting anyone close enough to matter. He'd been scared too. He still was. But fear didn't change the fact that Mia needed a home. And it didn't change the fact that Celeste, whether she admitted it or not, needed someone who wouldn't leave. So he stayed. And slowly, quietly, the house started to feel a little less like a prison. A month passed before Nolan realized he'd stopped counting the days. He woke up one morning, made Mia's breakfast, got her ready for school, and didn't think once about how long they'd been there or how long they'd stay. It was the first time in years that the future didn't feel like a countdown to disaster. The routine had settled in. Celeste still found things to criticize, but the edge had dulled. She'd taste her food, nod once, and move on. She didn't thank him. She didn't compliment him. But she stopped sending meals back to the kitchen, and that felt like progress. Mia had adjusted faster than he expected. She loved her new school, loved her room, loved the fact that there was always food in the fridge and hot water in the shower. She didn't ask about the old apartment anymore. She didn't ask when they were leaving. And Celeste, in her own strange way, had started to soften. Not obviously, not in any way someone else might notice, but Nolan saw it. The way she'd pause when Mia came into the room, the way her gaze would linger on the drawings stuck to the fridge, the way she'd wheel herself to the window in the afternoons and watch Mia play outside, her expression unreadable but not cold. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't ice either. One evening, Nolan was in the kitchen prepping dinner when Mia burst through the door, her backpack trailing behind her. "Daddy, guess what?" He looked up from the cutting board. "What?" "We're doing a project at school about families, and I want to do mine about us, and I need to draw a picture and write about what makes our family special, and can I use the big markers?" Nolan set down the knife. "Slow down, baby. What project?" Mia climbed onto one of the stools at the counter, her legs swinging. "It's for Parents' Day. We have to make a poster about our family, and then we put it up in the classroom and everyone's parents come and look at them." "Parents' Day," Nolan repeated. He wiped his hands on a towel. "When is it?" "Next Friday." "Okay, yeah, we can do that. Are you going to come?" "Of course I'm going to come." Mia grinned. Then her face scrunched up in thought. "Can Miss Arden come too?" Nolan froze. "What? Can she come to Parents' Day?" "Why would you want her to come?" "Because she lives here, so she's kind of like family, right?" Nolan didn't know how to answer that. Celeste wasn't family, she was his employer. But Mia didn't see it that way. To her, family was just people who lived in the same house and ate at the same table, even if that table had assigned seats and strict meal times. "I don't think she'd want to go, baby." "You could ask. Mia." "Please?" He sighed. "I'll think about it." Mia's grin came back full force. "Thanks, Daddy." She hopped off the stool and ran upstairs, leaving Nolan standing in the kitchen wondering how he was supposed to ask his boss, a woman who barely tolerated his presence, to attend a second-grade Parents' Day event. He didn't ask that night, or the next day. But Mia brought it up again at breakfast, and then again at dinner, and by the third day Nolan knew he wasn't getting out of it. So that evening, after Mia was in bed, he found Celeste in her office. She was at her desk, staring at her laptop screen with the kind of focus that made it clear she didn't want to be interrupted. Nolan knocked on the doorframe anyway. She didn't look up. "What? Can I talk to you for a minute?" "You are talking to me." "It's about Mia." That got her attention. She glanced up, her expression guarded. "Is something wrong?" "No, she's fine. It's just, there's this thing at her school next Friday, Parents' Day. The kids are making posters about their families and the parents come to see them. She wants you to come." Celeste stared at him. "She wants me to come." "Yeah." "Why?" "Because she thinks you're part of the family." Celeste's jaw tightened. She looked back at the screen. "I'm not." I know that, but she's 6. She doesn't really get the difference. Then explain it to her. I tried. She doesn't care. Celeste closed the laptop with more force than necessary. I don't go to school events. I'm not asking you to chaperone a field trip. It's an hour, maybe less. You just show up, look at the poster, tell her it's nice, and leave. No. She's going to be disappointed. She'll get over it. Nolan crossed his arms. You know, for someone who acts like she doesn't care about anything, you sure do spend a lot of time watching her play outside. Celeste's eyes snapped to his, sharp and defensive. I don't... Yeah, you do. Every afternoon. You sit by the window and you watch her. I've seen you. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? No, because watching from a distance doesn't cost me anything. Going to that school, being stared at, answering questions I don't want to answer, that cost me everything. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Nolan saw it again. That flash of something raw, something she spent every waking moment trying to bury. He softened. You don't have to answer anything. You don't even have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Just be there. For her. Celeste turned her chair away from him. Get out. Celeste, I said get out. He left. The next morning, Celeste didn't come down for breakfast. Nolan brought a tray to her room and left it outside the door. When he came back an hour later, the food was gone, but the door was still closed. Mia asked about it at dinner. Is Miss Arden okay? She's fine, just busy. Did you ask her about Parents' Day? Nolan hesitated. Yeah, I asked. What'd she say? She said she can't make it. Mia's face fell. Oh. But I'll be there. That's what matters, right? Mia nodded, but she didn't smile. She poked at her food with her fork, her enthusiasm from earlier in the week completely gone. Nolan felt the guilt twist in his chest. He'd known Celeste would say no. He shouldn't have let Mia get her hopes up. That night, after Mia was asleep, he heard a noise from downstairs. He pulled on a shirt and went to check. Celeste was in the living room sitting by the window. The lights were off, and the only illumination came from the moon outside. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring out into the dark. Nolan almost turned around and went back upstairs, but something stopped him. He walked into the room and sat down on the couch across from her. Couldn't sleep? She didn't answer. Me neither, he said. They sat in silence for a while. Then Celeste spoke, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. I had a daughter. Nolan's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Her name was Lily. She was 4. Celeste's hands were folded in her lap, her gaze still fixed on the window. We were driving home from her preschool. It was raining. The roads were slick. I didn't see the truck until it was too late. Nolan's throat tightened. She died in the hospital 3 hours later. I woke up 2 days after that, and they told me I'd never walk again. And I thought... Her voice broke. I thought that was the punishment for not paying attention, for not being good enough to save her. Celeste, Nolan said quietly. She shook her head. I don't go to school events because I can't. Because every time I see a little girl with dark hair and a backpack, I see her. And I can't breathe, and I can't think. And I just want to disappear. Nolan didn't know what to say. There were no words for something like that, no platitudes that would make it better. So he didn't offer any. He just sat there, letting her say what she needed to say. After a long moment, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Your daughter deserves better than a broken stranger who can't even look at her without falling apart. Maybe, Nolan said, but she asked for you anyway. Celeste finally looked at him. Her eyes were red, her face pale. Why? Because she sees something in you that you don't see in yourself. She's 6. She doesn't know anything. She knows enough. Celeste turned back to the window. I can't do it. Okay, Nolan said, and he meant it. He wasn't going to push her, not on this. But if you change your mind, the offer stands. He stood and walked toward the stairs. He was halfway up when he heard her voice behind him. What time does it start? He stopped, turned. 10. She didn't say anything else. Just nodded once and wheeled herself toward her room. Nolan wasn't sure if that meant she'd come or not, but it was more than he'd expected. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Mia worked on her poster every night, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew pictures of the three of them in front of the house. She added flowers to the garden, a sun in the corner, and a banner at the top that said "My Family" in uneven letters. Nolan helped her glue everything down and made sure the markers didn't bleed through the paper. She was proud of it. He could see it in the way she kept stepping back to admire her work, her hands on her hips like a tiny art critic. On the morning of Parents' Day, Mia was up before her alarm, bouncing around the house in her favorite dress. Nolan made her breakfast and braided her hair, then loaded the poster into the car. Celeste hadn't mentioned the event again. Nolan didn't bring it up. But when he came downstairs with Mia, Celeste was waiting by the door. She was dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, professional, but her hands were trembling. Mia's eyes went wide. "You're coming?" Celeste's gaze flicked to Nolan, then back to Mia. Apparently, Mia let out a squeal and ran over, throwing her arms around Celeste's legs before Nolan could stop her. Celeste stiffened, her hands hovering in the air like she didn't know what to do with them. Then slowly, she let one hand rest on Mia's back. "Thank you," Mia whispered. Celeste didn't respond, but Nolan saw the way her throat worked, the way she blinked hard and looked away. They drove to the school in 2 cars. Nolan took Mia in his sedan, and Celeste followed in the accessible van Mrs. Calloway had arranged. The parking lot was already full when they arrived, and Nolan could see clusters of parents heading inside, chatting and laughing. Celeste pulled into the handicapped spot near the entrance. Nolan waited for her, and when she finally emerged from the van, he could see the tension in every line of her body. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "No. You want to leave?" She looked at him, then at Mia, who was already halfway to the door, her poster clutched in both hands. "Ask me again in an hour." They went inside. The classroom was bright and loud, filled with kids and parents and posters taped to every available wall. Mia's teacher, a cheerful woman in her 40s, greeted them at the door and directed them to Mia's spot near the window. Mia's poster was already up, surrounded by others that ranged from elaborate scrapbook-style collages to crayon drawings that looked like they'd been done 5 minutes before class. Mia stood in front of hers, beaming. "This is us," she announced, pointing to each figure. "That's Daddy, that's me, and that's Miss Arden, and that's our house, and those are the flowers I want to plant in the garden." Celeste stared at this poster, at the 3 stick figures holding hands in front of the angular glass house, at the crooked letters spelling out "My Family." She didn't say anything. "Do you like it?" Mia asked, her voice small. Celeste's gaze moved from the poster to Mia, and for the first time since Nolan had met her, he saw her smile. It was faint, barely there, but it was real. "It's perfect," Celeste said. Mia's grin could have lit the entire room. Other parents started to drift over, complimenting Mia on her work. A few glanced at Celeste with curiosity, but no one asked questions. Nolan stayed close, ready to deflect if anyone got too nosy. But Celeste handled it. She nodded politely when people spoke to her, kept her answers short, and didn't flinch when a little boy ran past her chair too fast and nearly knocked into her. She lasted the full hour. And when they finally left, Mia holding both their hands, Nolan saw something in Celeste's expression that hadn't been there before. Relief. Maybe even pride. That night, Mia fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Nolan tucked her in, turned off the light, and went downstairs. Celeste was in the living room, staring at her laptop but not really looking at it. "Hey," Nolan said. She glanced up. "Hey, you did good today." "I didn't do anything." "You showed up. That's more than most people would have done." Celeste closed the laptop. "She drew me into her poster." "Yeah. I'm not her family." "You tell her that?" Celeste didn't answer. Nolan sat down across from her. "Look, I get it. This isn't what you signed up for. You wanted someone to run your house, not someone who'd drag you to school events and let their kid plaster your fridge with dragon drawings. But Mia doesn't see it that way. To her, you're not just the lady who owns the house. You're someone who matters. She doesn't know me. Maybe not, but she wants to." Celeste looked away. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be around her, be around you without—" She stopped. her hands gripping the armrests, without feeling like I'm going to break. Then break, Nolan said simply. You think I haven't? You think I didn't fall apart 100 times after my wife left? After I lost my job? After I realized I couldn't give Mia the life she deserved? I broke. And then I put myself back together. And then I broke again. That's what people do. I'm not people. Yeah, you are. You just don't want to admit it. Celeste's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Nolan stood. I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to drop it. You don't owe me anything. You don't owe Mia anything. But if you want to be part of this, whatever this is, we're here, and we're not going anywhere. He left before she could respond. The next morning, Celeste came down to breakfast for the first time since they'd moved in. She sat at the table while Nolan cooked, and when Mia came downstairs, she didn't flinch. She just nodded at the empty chair across from her. Sit. Mia sat, and for the first time they ate together. It wasn't perfect. The conversation was stilted, the silence is awkward, but it was something, and that was enough. Over the following weeks, things shifted in ways Nolan hadn't expected. Celeste started spending more time in the common areas of the house. She'd work on her laptop in the living room instead of her office, positioning herself where she could see Mia playing. She asked questions, small ones at first. What Mia was learning in school, what her favorite color was, whether she liked her teacher. Mia answered every question with enthusiasm, completely unfazed by Celeste's bluntness. And Celeste, in turn, started to relax. Not all the way, but enough that Nolan noticed the difference. One afternoon, he found them in the living room together. Mia was on the floor with her coloring books, and Celeste was reading something on her tablet. Neither of them was talking, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just quiet. Nolan stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't announce himself, he just took it in. This was what he'd been fighting for, not just a roof over their heads or a paycheck, but this, a sense of stability, of safety, of something that almost felt like home. He didn't know how long it would last. He didn't know if Celeste would wake up one day and decide she'd had enough. But for now, it was enough. Later that night, after Mia was asleep, Nolan was cleaning up the kitchen when Celeste wheeled in. I need to talk to you, she said. He set down the dish he was holding. Okay. She looked uncomfortable, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I've been thinking about expanding my company's outreach. There's a gap in accessibility services for people with disabilities, rehabilitation programs that actually work, support systems that don't treat people like charity cases. Nolan nodded. That sounds good. I want to start a foundation, something separate from the company, something that focuses on real, long-term solutions. She paused. And I want you to help me run it. Nolan blinked. What? You're organized, you're detail-oriented, and you understand what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. I think you'd be good at this. Celeste, I don't have any experience with... Neither did I when I started my company. You'll learn. He stared at her. Why me? Because you're the only person who's ever stayed. The words hung in the air between them. Nolan didn't know what to say. This wasn't just a job offer. It was trust, real trust, the kind that didn't come easy for someone like Celeste. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, he said honestly. You are. You just don't see it yet. She turned her chair toward the door, then paused. Think about it. We'll talk more tomorrow. She left, and Nolan stood alone in the kitchen, his mind racing. A foundation, a real future. Not just survival, but something bigger. He thought about Mia, about the life he wanted to give her, about the fact that for the first time in a long time he could actually see a path forward. And he thought about Celeste, about the way she'd looked at Mia's poster, about the way she'd smiled, barely, but it was there. She was letting them in, slowly, carefully. But she was doing it, and Nolan realized with a clarity that almost scared him that he didn't want to leave. Not just because of the job or the house or the stability, but because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about survival and started being about something else, something that felt a lot like belonging. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to stay, and he was going to fight for this, for all of them. Nolan said yes to the foundation the next morning, and within 2 weeks, his entire life had changed again. He wasn't just managing the house anymore. He was sitting in on conference calls with lawyers and architects, reviewing proposals for rehabilitation centers, learning terms like accessibility compliance and grant funding structures. Celeste threw him into the deep end without a life raft, and somehow he managed to keep his head above water. Most nights he stayed up late reading documents Celeste had sent him, his eyes burning from the screen light. Mia would fall asleep on the couch beside him, her head on his shoulder, and he'd carry her upstairs and then go back to work. It was exhausting, but it was also the first time in his life he felt like he was building something that mattered. Celeste was different too. She was still blunt, still impossible to please, but there was an energy to her now that hadn't been there before. She talked faster, moved faster, filled the house with the kind of intensity that came from someone who'd finally found a reason to care again. And then there was the way she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't paying attention, like she was trying to figure him out, like she wasn't sure if she should trust what she was seeing. Nolan tried not to think about it too much, but it was getting harder to ignore. One evening, they were working in her office, going over the budget for the first rehabilitation center. Mia was upstairs doing homework, and the house was quiet except for the sound of Celeste's fingers on the keyboard. "We're 5,000 over," she said, her eyes still on the screen. "We need to cut somewhere." Nolan scanned the spreadsheet. "What if we go with the standard lighting instead of the custom fixtures?" "The custom fixtures are better for people with visual impairments." "Then cut the landscaping budget." "The landscaping is part of the therapeutic environment." "Celeste, we have to cut something." She sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. "I know." They'd been doing this for an hour, going in circles, neither of them willing to compromise on things that actually mattered. It should have been frustrating. But instead, Nolan found himself almost enjoying it. The back and forth, the way she challenged him, the way she actually listened when he pushed back. "What if we delay the grand opening by a month?" he suggested. "That gives us time to do another fundraising push. We could bring in enough to cover the overage and then some." Celeste considered it, then nodded. "That could work?" "Yeah? Yeah." She looked at him, and for a second something passed between them. Something Nolan couldn't quite name but felt all the way through. Then her phone buzzed, and the moment was gone. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted. "It's my doctor. I need to take this." "Sure." She wheeled herself out into the hallway and Nolan heard her voice, low and tense, though he couldn't make out the words. He went back to the spreadsheet, trying to focus, but his mind kept drifting. When Celeste came back 10 minutes later, she looked shaken. "Everything okay?" Nolan asked. She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring at nothing, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so hard her knuckles went white. "Celeste? They want me to come in for more tests." "What kind of tests?" "The kind that might tell me if I'll ever walk again." Nolan's chest tightened. "I thought they said that wasn't possible." "They said it was unlikely, not impossible." She finally looked at him, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Fear. Real, unfiltered fear. "There's a new procedure, experimental, it's brutal, and the success rate isn't great, but if it works—" She stopped, her throat working. "If it works, you could walk," Nolan finished. "Maybe. Or I could go through months of hell for nothing, or worse." "Worse how?" "Nerve damage, chronic pain. There's a chance I could end up in more pain than I'm already in, with no improvement." She laughed, but it was hollow. "So basically, I get to choose between staying like this or gambling everything on a procedure that might destroy me." Nolan didn't know what to say. There were no good answers here, no easy solutions. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. "I don't know." She turned her chair toward the window, her back to him. "For 3 years, I've told myself this is it. This is my life now. I made peace with it. Or I thought I did. And now they're telling me maybe it doesn't have to be, and I don't know if I can survive hoping for something that might not happen." Nolan stood and walked over to her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, close enough that she'd know he wasn't leaving. "You don't have to decide right now," he said. "The doctor wants an answer by the end of the week. Then take the week, think about it, and whatever you decide, I'm here." She looked up at him, her eyes red but dry. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why are you still here? You could have left a dozen times by now. You've got enough saved up to get your own place. You don't need this job anymore, so why stay?" Nolan hesitated. He could have given her a dozen reasons. The foundation, the stability, Mia's school. But none of them were the real answer. The real answer was standing in front of him, looking more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her, and he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Because I want to," he said simply. Celeste stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. "You're an idiot." "Yeah, probably." She didn't say anything else, but Nolan saw the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. The next few days were tense. Celeste didn't bring up the procedure again, but Nolan could see it weighing on her. She was quieter than usual, more distant. She skipped meals, stayed in her office until late into the night. Mia noticed, too. "Is Miss Arden mad at us?" she asked one night at dinner. "No, baby. She's just thinking about something important." "Can I help?" "I don't think so. But you can keep being you. That helps more than you know." Mia seemed to accept that, but the next day she left a drawing on Celeste's desk. It was a picture of the three of them standing in front of the rehabilitation center, holding hands, with a banner that said, "You can do it," in big, uneven letters. When Celeste saw it, she sat at her desk for a long time, just staring at the paper. Then she picked up her phone and called the doctor. She didn't tell Nolan what she'd decided, not right away. But 2 days later, she called him into her office and said, "I'm doing it. The procedure. I start next month." Nolan felt relief and dread in equal measure. "Okay. It's going to be bad. The recovery, I mean. I'll be in the hospital for at least 2 weeks, and then I'll need round-the-clock care for another month after that. I won't be able to work. I won't be able to do anything. We'll handle it." "You don't understand. I'm going to be useless, worse than useless, and I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to take it out on everyone around me, and—" "Celeste," Nolan leaned forward. "We'll handle it." She looked at him, searching his face for doubt. She didn't find any. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay?" But before the procedure could happen, everything else fell apart. It started at Mia's school. She came home one afternoon with her backpack slung low and her shoulders hunched, and Nolan knew immediately something was wrong. "Hey," he said, crouching down to her level. "What happened?" Mia didn't answer. She just walked past him and went straight to her room. Nolan followed. He found her sitting on her bed, her face buried in her hands. "Mia, talk to me." "They were making fun of me." "Who was?" "Everyone." Her voice cracked. "They said we're poor. They said we live in someone else's house because we can't afford our own. They said Miss Arden only lets us stay because she feels sorry for us." Nolan's stomach dropped. "Who said that?" "Emma. And her friends. They saw you drop me off this morning, and they asked why we don't have a nice car like theirs. And I said we didn't need one, and they just laughed. Baby. And then they said Miss Arden is weird and creepy, and they asked why she's in a wheelchair, and I told them it was none of their business, and they said I was being mean." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Why are they so mean, Daddy?" Nolan pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "Because some people don't know how to be anything else. I hate them. I know." "I don't want to go back." "You have to go back, baby. But I'll talk to your teacher, and we'll figure it out." Mia cried into his shoulder, and Nolan felt something dark and furious curl in his chest. He wanted to march into that school and tell those kids exactly what he thought of them. He wanted to tell their parents. He wanted to fix it. But he couldn't. Because the truth was, those kids weren't wrong. He and Mia were living in someone else's house. They didn't have money. They were different. And no amount of anger was going to change that. That night, after Mia finally fell asleep, Nolan went downstairs and found Celeste in the living room. "She okay?" Celeste asked. "Not really." "What happened?" Nolan told her. All of it. The kids at school, the things they'd said, the way Mia had cried. Celeste's expression darkened. "Names." "What?" "Give me the names of the kids who said those things." "Celeste, you can't—" "I'm not going to do anything to them. But their parents might be interested to know that their children are bullying a 6-year-old. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is. People like that only stop when there are consequences." Nolan shook his head. "It won't help. It'll just make Mia a bigger target." "Then what do you want to do? Let her suffer?" "No, I want to—" He stopped, frustration boiling over. "I don't know, okay? I don't have the answers. I'm just trying to keep her safe and happy, and I don't know how to do that when the world keeps reminding her that we don't fit." Celeste was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She fits here." Nolan looked at her. "What?" "Mia. She fits here. In this house. With us. And if the rest of the world doesn't see that, then screw them. Celeste, I mean it. She belongs here. You both do. And I don't care what some spoiled brat at a private school thinks about it." Nolan felt something crack open in his chest. Something he'd been keeping locked away because it was too dangerous, too complicated, too real. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Doing what?" "Caring. About us. About her. You didn't have to. You could have kept your distance, but you didn't, so why?" Celeste's jaw tightened. For a second, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Because you stayed. When everyone else left, you stayed. And I don't know how to repay that except by staying too." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Nolan wanted to say something. Wanted to tell her that it wasn't about repayment, that he wasn't staying because he expected anything in return. But before he could find the words, Celeste turned her chair and wheeled out of the room. And Nolan was left standing there, his heart pounding, wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with everything he was feeling. The situation at school didn't get better. Mia tried to put on a brave face, but Nolan could see the way it was eating at her. She stopped talking about her friends, stopped bringing home drawings, started asking if she could be homeschooled instead. Nolan talked to the teacher who promised to keep an eye on things. But promises didn't stop whispers in the hallway or snide comments at lunch. And then, a week before Celeste's procedure, it all came to a head. Nolan got a call from the school in the middle of the afternoon. Mia had gotten into a fight. She'd pushed another student, and now the principal wanted to see him. He drove to the school with his heart in his throat, half expecting the worst. When he got there, Mia was sitting in the principal's office, her arms crossed and her face red. The principal, a stern woman in her 50s, gestured for Nolan to sit. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming." "What happened?" Mia pushed another student during recess. The other child fell and scraped her knee. Nolan looked at Mia. "Is that true?" Mia didn't answer. "Mia! She said you were a loser," Mia burst out. "She said we're charity cases and that Miss Arden is only keeping us around because she's lonely and pathetic. So I pushed her, and I'd do it again." The principal's expression tightened. "Mia, violence is never the answer. Neither is letting people be cruel," Nolan interrupted. "Has anyone talked to this other kid about what she said? That's not the issue right now." "Yes, it is, because my daughter doesn't lash out for no reason. If she pushed someone, it's because she was provoked." The principal sighed. "Mr. Hayes, I understand you're upset, but Mia needs to learn that physical aggression is unacceptable. And the other kids need to learn that words have consequences." They went back and forth for another 10 minutes, but it didn't matter. Mia was getting a 3-day suspension. The other kid was getting a talking to. Nolan took Mia's hand and walked her out of the office, his anger simmering just below the surface. When they got to the car, Mia finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Daddy. Don't be sorry for standing up for yourself. But I got in trouble. Sometimes doing the right thing gets you in trouble. That doesn't mean it wasn't right." Mia looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Are you mad at me?" "No, baby. I'm proud of you." She smiled, just a little. But Nolan could see the toll it was taking, the weight of being different, of being judged, of having to fight just to exist. And he wondered how much longer she could carry it. That night, Celeste was waiting for them when they got home. She took one look at Mia's face and said, "What happened?" Mia told her. Everything. The fight, the suspension, the things the other kid had said. When she was done, Celeste was silent for a long moment. Then she looked at Nolan. "We need to talk." They went into her office while Mia stayed in the living room and Celeste shut the door behind them. "This can't keep happening," she said. "I know." "She's miserable, and it's only going to get worse." "I know." Celeste leaned forward, her elbows on her desk. "I'm going to make a proposal, and I want you to actually think about it before you say no." Nolan crossed his arms. "Okay. Move in, officially, not as my employee, as my partner, in the foundation, in this house, in everything. We make this a real home for Mia. We give her stability. We give her a family. And we stop pretending this is temporary. Nolan stared at her. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I don't want Mia to leave. And I'm tired of pretending I'm okay with the idea that someday you might. Celeste, I know it's complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why it's a bad idea, but I don't care anymore. I want you to stay, both of you. Not because I need a housekeeper or an assistant, but because you're the only people who've made this place feel like something other than a tomb. Nolan's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. You're serious? Yes. And what happens when you decide you're done with us? When this gets too hard or too messy or too real? Then I'll deal with it, but I'm not going to walk away just because it's scary. I've spent 3 years hiding from everything that scares me, and I'm done. So either you're in or you're not. But I need to know. Nolan looked at her, at the woman who'd been impossible and cold and cruel when they first met, the woman who'd slowly, painfully let them in, the woman who was now sitting in front of him, asking him to stay. I'm in, he said. Celeste's breath hitched. Yeah. She smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made her look younger, lighter, like the weight she'd been carrying had finally started to lift. Okay, she said. Okay. And just like that, everything changed again. They told Mia the next morning over breakfast. She was picking at her cereal, still quiet from the suspension, when Celeste wheeled herself up to the table and said, We need to talk to you about something. Mia looked up, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. Am I in trouble again? No, Nolan said quickly. You're not in trouble. Celeste folded her hands on the table. How would you feel about staying here permanently, not as guests, as family? Mia blinked. Like forever? Like forever, Celeste confirmed. For a moment, Mia just stared at them. Then her face broke into the biggest smile Nolan had seen in weeks. Really? Really, Nolan said. Mia dropped her spoon and launched herself out of her chair, wrapping her arms around Celeste's neck before either adult could stop her. Celeste stiffened, her hands hovering awkwardly, but then she let them settle on Mia's back. Thank you, Mia whispered. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Celeste's eyes met Nolan's over Mia's shoulder, and for a second he saw everything she was feeling. The fear, the hope, the terrifying possibility that this might actually work. When Mia finally let go, she was bouncing on her toes. Can I decorate my room? Can I paint it purple? Can I get a bigger bed? We'll see, Nolan said, but he was smiling. That means yes. That means we'll talk about it. Well, Mia didn't seem to care. She was already running upstairs, probably to start planning exactly how she wanted her room to look. Nolan looked at Celeste. You sure about this? No, she said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. That's not exactly reassuring. I'm not good at reassuring. You know that by now. He did. But somehow, it didn't matter. The next week was a blur of preparation. Celeste's procedure was scheduled for the following Monday, and there was still a mountain of work to do for the foundation. They worked late into the nights, finalizing contracts, reviewing architectural plans, making sure everything was in place so the project wouldn't fall apart while she was in recovery. Nolan could see the strain on her, the way her hands shook sometimes when she thought no one was looking, the way she'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd find her in the living room staring out the window. You having second thoughts? He asked one of those nights. She didn't turn around. Every single second. You can still back out. I know, but you're not going to. No. Nolan sat down on the couch. What are you afraid of? Celeste was quiet for a long time. Then she said, that it won't work, that I'll go through all of this and end up exactly where I started, or worse. And if it does work, then I'll have to figure out who I am without this. She gestured to the wheelchair. For 3 years, this has been my excuse, my shield, the reason I don't have to let people in or try or risk anything. And if it's gone, I don't know what's left. You, Nolan said simply. What's left is you. That's what I'm afraid of. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was more than her pain, more than her grief, more than the walls she'd built. But he knew she wouldn't believe him. Not yet. So instead he just sat with her in the dark, and eventually she wheeled herself back to her room. The day before the procedure, Celeste asked Nolan to take her somewhere. Where? He asked. You'll see. They left Mia with Mrs. Calloway and drove for half an hour, heading out of the city and into the countryside. Celeste navigated from the passenger seat, her voice steady but her hands tight in her lap. Finally, she told him to turn down a narrow road that led to a small cemetery. Nolan's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask. He parked near the entrance and helped Celeste into her chair. She didn't say anything as they made their way down the path, past rows of headstones, until she stopped in front of a small granite marker. Lily Marie Arden, beloved daughter, 4 years old. Nolan stayed back, giving her space. He watched as Celeste reached out and touched the stone, her fingers tracing the letters of her daughter's name. I haven't been here in 2 years, she said quietly. I couldn't. Every time I tried, I'd get halfway here and turn around. Why now? Because I need to tell her I'm trying, that I'm not giving up. Her voice cracked. I need her to know that even though she's gone, I'm still here, and I'm going to fight to actually be here, not just exist, but live. Nolan's throat burned. He wanted to say something, but there were no words that felt big enough. Celeste wiped her eyes and looked up at him. I'm terrified. I know. What if I can't do it? Then we'll figure it out. Together. She nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that no amount of reassurance could fully touch. They stayed for another 20 minutes, and then Celeste said she was ready to go. On the drive back, she was quiet, lost in her own thoughts. But when they pulled into the driveway, she reached over and squeezed his hand. Thank you, she said. For what? For not letting me do this alone. Nolan squeezed back. You're stuck with me now. You know that, right? She smiled, just a little. Yeah, I know. The morning of the procedure, Nolan woke up before his alarm. He got Mia ready for school, made breakfast, and tried to act like everything was normal, but his stomach was in knots. Celeste was already awake when he went to check on her. She was dressed in comfortable clothes, her bag packed and sitting by the door. You ready? He asked. No? Yeah, me neither. They loaded into the van and drove to the hospital in silence. Mia had insisted on coming, even though Nolan had tried to convince her to go to school. She sat in the back, holding Mr. Floppy and humming nervously. At the hospital, they checked Celeste in and waited. The pre-op process took hours. Forms to sign, tests to run, doctors to consult. Nolan stayed by her side the whole time, and Mia sat in the corner with a coloring book, sneaking glances at Celeste every few minutes. Finally, they wheeled Celeste back to prep her for surgery. Nolan walked with her as far as they'd let him, and when they reached the double doors, she grabbed his hand. If something goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, Celeste, it won't. She looked at him, her eyes glassy. Take care of Mia. And the foundation. Don't let it fall apart. I won't have to, because you're going to be fine. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Then she let go of his hand and disappeared through the doors. Nolan stood there for a long time, staring at the space where she'd been. Then he turned and walked back to the waiting room, where Mia was curled up in a chair. Is she going to be okay? Mia asked. Yeah, baby. She's going to be okay. You promise? Nolan pulled her into his lap. I promise. He didn't know if it was true, but he said it anyway, because sometimes that's all you could do. The surgery took 8 hours. Nolan spent the first 2 pacing, the next 3 sitting in increasingly uncomfortable chairs, trying to distract Mia with games and snacks. The last 3 watching the clock and wondering why no one had come out to update them yet. Finally, a doctor appeared, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and scrubs that looked like they'd seen better days. Family of Celeste Arden? Nolan stood. That's us. The surgery went well. We were able to complete the procedure without complications. She's in recovery now. Nolan felt the tension drain out of him all at once. She's okay. She's stable. But the real work starts now. The next few weeks are going to be critical. She'll be in a lot of pain, and the physical therapy will be intense. There's no guarantee this will result in her regaining mobility, but we've done everything we can on our end. When can we see her? She'll be out for a few more hours. You can see her once she's awake, but only for a few minutes. She needs rest. Nolan nodded. Thank you. The doctor left and Nolan sat back down, pulling Mia close. She'd fallen asleep at some point, her head resting against his chest. He kissed the top of her head and closed his eyes. They'd made it through the first hurdle. Now came the hard part. When they finally let Nolan in to see Celeste, she looked small. That was the only word for it. She was propped up in the hospital bed, tubes and wires running from her arms, her face pale and drawn. But she was awake. "Hey," Nolan said quietly. She turned her head toward him, her movements slow. "Hey, how do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "That's probably accurate." She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Did they tell you?" "Yeah, they said it went well." "They say that about everything. Doesn't mean it's true." "Celeste, I'm serious. I can't feel anything below my waist. What if it didn't work? What if I just put myself through this for nothing? Then we deal with it. But you don't know that yet. Give it time." She looked away, her jaw tight. "I don't know if I have any left." Nolan pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down. "You've got plenty, and you've got us. So stop acting like you're doing this alone." She didn't respond, but he saw the way her throat worked, the way she blinked hard and looked at the ceiling. After a moment, she said, "Where's Mia?" "In the waiting room. They wouldn't let her come back." "Good. I don't want her to see me like this." "She's going to see you eventually." "I know, but not yet." Nolan didn't argue. He just sat with her until a nurse came in and told him visiting hours were over. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Celeste nodded. "Okay." He stood to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Nolan?" He turned. "Thank you. For staying." "Always," he said. And he meant it. The next 2 weeks were the hardest Nolan had ever lived through. Celeste was in the hospital for the first week, and every day Nolan brought Mia to visit. Every day Celeste looked a little worse. The pain was relentless, and the medications they gave her barely took the edge off. She snapped at the nurses, refused to eat, and spent most of her time staring at the wall. Nolan didn't take it personally. He knew this wasn't about him, but it was brutal to watch. The physical therapy started on day 5. They brought in a therapist who tried to get Celeste to do basic exercises, and she lasted all of 10 minutes before she told them to get out. "I can't do this," she said when Nolan came to visit that afternoon. "Yes, you can." "No, I can't. It hurts too much." "I know it hurts, but you have to push through." "Why?" "So I can spend months torturing myself for something that might not even happen?" "Because you told Lily you were going to fight, and you don't get to give up now." Celeste's eyes flashed. "Don't you dare use her against me." "I'm not using her against you. I'm reminding you why you're doing this." "I don't need you to remind me of anything." "Clearly you do, because you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself instead of doing the work." She glared at him, and for a second he thought she might throw something, but then her face crumpled and she turned away. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know." "What if it doesn't work?" "Then we'll deal with it. But you have to try first." She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "Okay." The next day she did the therapy. It was excruciating. Nolan could see it in every line of her body, in the way her hands gripped the rails, in the way she bit down on her lip so hard it bled. But she did it. And the day after that, she did it again. By the time they released her from the hospital, she was exhausted but determined. They set her up in a room on the first floor of the house, and Nolan hired a nurse to help with the round-the-clock care she needed. Mia tiptoed around her at first, unsure how to act, but Celeste, despite everything, made an effort. She let Mia sit with her in the evenings, reading books or telling stories about school. She didn't always have the energy to respond, but she listened, and slowly, painfully, she started to improve. The first time she felt sensation in her legs, she cried. Not happy tears, just overwhelming, complicated tears that came from 3 years of grief and pain finally cracking open. Nolan held her hand and let her fall apart. "It's working," she said, her voice shaking. "It's actually working." "Yeah," Nolan said. "It is." But working didn't mean easy. The physical therapy sessions were brutal. Some days Celeste could barely get out of bed. Other days she pushed herself so hard she'd collapse afterward, shaking and nauseous. And through it all, Nolan was there. He made her meals. He helped her with exercises. He sat with her when the pain got too bad to bear alone. Mia helped too, in her own way. She'd draw pictures and tape them to the walls of Celeste's room. She'd sit on the floor and do her homework while Celeste rested. She'd tell her about the dragon she was building out of Legos, or the story she'd written for class, or the new friend she'd made at school. And Celeste, despite everything, smiled. One night, about a month into recovery, Nolan found Celeste standing. Not in her wheelchair, not leaning on anything, just standing. She was gripping the edge of the bed, her legs shaking, her face twisted in concentration. But she was upright. "Celeste," Nolan said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, and there were tears streaming down her face. "I'm standing." "Yeah, you are." "I didn't think I'd ever—" Her voice broke, and she started to collapse. Nolan rushed forward and caught her, lowering her gently onto the bed. She clung to him, her whole body trembling. "I did it," she whispered. "I actually did it." "You did," Nolan said, holding her close. "You did." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and the expression on her face was something Nolan had never seen before. Relief, joy, hope, and something else. Something that made his heart pound. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For believing I could." Nolan didn't know what to say, so he just held her and let her cry, and wondered how he'd ever thought he could keep his distance from this woman. The progress continued, slowly, but it was there. Celeste went from standing to taking a few steps with a walker, then a few more without it. The physical therapist was cautiously optimistic, and Celeste started to let herself hope. But with the hope came a new kind of fear. One evening, she asked Nolan to sit with her in the living room. Mia was upstairs, and the house was quiet. "I need to tell you something," Celeste said. Nolan sat down across from her. "Okay." She took a breath. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "This. Us. Whatever we're becoming." She looked at him, her expression raw. "I spent 3 years convincing myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own. And then you showed up and you didn't leave. And now I don't know how to be alone anymore. And that terrifies me." Nolan's chest tightened. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because what if you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and realize you don't want this? That I'm too much or too broken or too—" "Celeste, stop." She stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," Nolan said. "I've told you that 100 times, and I'm going to keep telling you until you believe it. You're not too much. You're not too broken. You're just you, and that's enough." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen you at your worst, and I'm still here. Because I've watched you fight for something you weren't even sure you wanted, and you did it anyway. Because when I look at you, I don't see someone who's broken. I see someone who's brave." Celeste's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not brave." "Yeah, you are. You just don't see it yet." She looked away, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "What if I can't give you what you need?" "What do you think I need?" "I don't know. Someone who's whole. Someone who doesn't come with all this baggage." Nolan leaned forward. "Celeste, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, no degree, and I spent 2 months living on the edge of homelessness. You think I don't come with baggage?" She laughed, but it was shaky. "That's different." "No, it's not. We're all a mess. The only difference is whether we're willing to be a mess together." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I, but we'll figure it out. You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple, but it's worth it." She was quiet. Then she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was tentative, uncertain, but it was there. "Okay," she said. "Okay." And Nolan felt something shift. Something that had been building for months, maybe since the beginning. Something that felt a lot like the start of something real. A few days later, the Foundation's first rehabilitation center passed its final inspections. The grand opening was scheduled for the following month, and Celeste insisted on being there. "You're not strong enough yet," Nolan argued. "I'll be strong enough by then." "Celeste, I'm going. End of discussion." And she did. She worked twice as hard in therapy, pushing herself to the point of exhaustion every single day. And by the time the grand opening arrived, she could walk with a cane for short distances. It wasn't perfect. She still needed the wheelchair for longer stretches. But it was progress. Real, tangible progress. The day of the opening, Nolan helped her get ready. She wore a navy dress and low heels and her hair was pulled back in the same severe bun she'd always worn. But there was something different about her now. A lightness. A sense of purpose. Mia insisted on wearing her best dress too, the purple one with the sparkles. She held Celeste's hand as they walked into the building, and Celeste didn't pull away. The place was beautiful, bright, open, accessible. Everything they'd worked for. There were reporters, donors, people from the community. And when Celeste stood at the podium to give her speech, Nolan saw her hands shake. But her voice didn't. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over, she said. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And in a lot of ways I had. But what I didn't realize then was that losing everything also meant I had the chance to rebuild, to create something new, something better. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Then it landed on Nolan and Mia, standing near the back. This center isn't just about accessibility. It's about hope. It's about showing people that even when everything falls apart, there's still a way forward. And I wouldn't be standing here today without the people who refused to let me give up. Her eyes stayed on Nolan. Thank you for everything. The room erupted in applause, and Nolan felt his throat tighten. Mia tugged on his hand. Daddy, she's talking about us. Yeah, baby, she is. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting and the tours, the crowd started to thin. Nolan found Celeste sitting on a bench outside, looking out at the garden they'd designed. You did good in there, he said, sitting down beside her. We did good, she corrected. Yeah, we did. They sat in silence for a while, watching Mia run around the garden, chasing butterflies. I have something to ask you, Celeste said. Nolan looked at her. Okay. She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that made his heart skip. I know this isn't traditional. I know we've done everything backward, but I don't care about traditional anymore. Celeste, will you marry me? Nolan stared at her. What? Will you marry me? She repeated. I don't have a ring. I don't have a plan, but I know I don't want to do this without you. Any of it. And I want to make it official. I want us to be a family. Really and truly. Nolan's mind was racing. This was insane. They'd known each other less than a year. They'd barely figured out what they were to each other. But when he looked at her, all he could see was the woman who'd let them in, who'd fought her way back from the edge, who'd chosen them over and over again. Yes, he said. Celeste's eyes widened. Yes? Yes. I'll marry you. She laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Then she kissed him, right there on the bench, and Nolan felt everything else fall away. When they finally pulled apart, Mia was standing in front of them, her hands on her hips. Are you guys going to get married? Celeste smiled. Yeah, we are. Mia's face lit up. Can I be in the wedding? You can be whatever you want. Can I wear a princess dress? Absolutely. Mia threw her arms around both of them, and Nolan held on tight. This was it. This was what he'd been fighting for, not just survival, not just a roof over their heads, but this, a family, a future, a home. And for the first time in his life, Nolan wasn't afraid of what came next. Planning a wedding turned out to be harder than running a foundation. Celeste wanted something small. Nolan didn't care as long as Mia got to wear her princess dress. But Mia had opinions. A lot of them. We need flowers, she announced one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook she'd decorated with stickers. Lots and lots of flowers, and a cake with 4 layers. And can we have a chocolate fountain? Baby, we're not having a chocolate fountain, Nolan said. Why not? Because weddings don't need chocolate fountains. Yes, they do. Emma's cousin had one at her wedding, and she said it was the best part. Celeste, who was sitting across from them reviewing vendor contracts, looked up. We can have a chocolate fountain. Nolan stared at her. We can? Why not? It's Mia's day, too. Mia squealed and threw her arms around Celeste's neck. Thank you, you're the best. Celeste's hands hovered for just a second before settling on Mia's back. She still wasn't completely comfortable with the affection, but she was getting better. Nolan watched them and felt something warm settle in his chest. This was real. This was happening. And somehow, despite everything, it felt right. But as the weeks went by and the wedding date got closer, the cracks started to show. Celeste's recovery was progressing, but it wasn't linear. Some days she could walk without the cane. Other days she couldn't get out of bed without help. The pain came and went in waves, and the frustration was eating her alive. One afternoon, Nolan found her in the living room, sitting on the floor with her head in her hands. "What happened?" he asked. "I fell. Are you hurt?"
"No, I'm fine. I'm just—" She looked up at him and her eyes were red. "I'm supposed to be getting better."
"And I am. But some days it feels like I'm right back where I started, and I can't stand it." Nolan sat down beside her. "You're allowed to have bad days. Not this close to the wedding. What if I can't walk down the aisle? What if I have to do it in the wheelchair? Then you do it in the wheelchair. It doesn't change anything."
"It changes everything. I wanted to walk. I wanted to prove that I could." "You've already proved it. You don't have anything left to prove." She shook her head. "You don't understand. Then help me understand."
Celeste was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "When Lily died, I thought I died too, and in a lot of ways I did. The person I was before the accident, she's gone, and I've spent 3 years trying to figure out who I am now. And walking again, it felt like the answer. Like if I could just do that, I'd be whole again." "You're already whole."
"No, I'm not. I'm still broken. I'm still scared, and I'm terrified that one day you're going to wake up and realize you signed up for someone who can't give you what you need." Nolan took her hand. "Celeste, look at me." She did. "I didn't fall in love with you because I thought you were perfect. I fell in love with you because you're real, because you're messy and stubborn, and you fight for what matters, even when it's hard. And yeah, some days are going to be bad. Some days you're going to need help. But that's not a flaw. That's just life." Her breath hitched. "You love me?" Nolan blinked. Yeah, I do." "You've never said that before." "I guess I thought you knew." "I didn't." He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you. Bad days and all. And I'm not going anywhere." Celeste closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I love you too." They sat there on the floor, holding each other, and Nolan thought about how far they'd both come, how broken they'd been when they met, how scared, and how somehow they'd managed to put each other back together. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late spring, in the garden behind the house. They'd hired a small team to set up chairs and an arch covered in white roses, and Mia had insisted on hanging paper lanterns from the trees. The guest list was short. Mrs. Calloway, a few people from the foundation, Nolan's friend Eric and his wife, Celeste's lawyer, who'd become something close to a friend over the past year, and Mia's teacher, who'd been one of the few people at the school to actually stand up for her when the bullying got bad. The morning of the wedding, Nolan woke up to Mia jumping on his bed. "It's wedding day! It's wedding day!" He groaned and pulled the pillow over his face. "It's 6 in the morning." "I know. We have so much to do." "Like what?" "Like get ready, and make sure the flowers are perfect, and check on the cake, and okay, I'm up." Mia grinned and ran out of the room, leaving Nolan staring at the ceiling and wondering how a 6-year-old had more energy than he'd had in his entire life. He got up, showered, and went downstairs to find Celeste already awake. She was in the kitchen, leaning on her cane, making coffee. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Nervous?" "Terrified." He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "We can still back out. Run away. Elope." She laughed. "Mia would never forgive us." "True." They stood there for a moment, just holding each other. Then Celeste turned in his arms and looked up at him. "I'm ready," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah." The ceremony was supposed to start at 3. By 2:30, Nolan was pacing in his room, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Eric knocked on the door. "You good?" "No." "You look good." "I feel like I'm going to throw up." "That's normal." "Is it?" Eric grinned. "No idea. I eloped. But I'm guessing it is." Nolan laughed despite himself. "Thanks. That helps." "Listen, man. You're doing the right thing. Celeste is great. Mia's great. You've got a good thing here. Don't overthink it." "I'm not overthinking it." "You're definitely overthinking it," Nolan sighed. "What if I screw this up?" "Then you'll fix it. That's what people do." It was simple advice, but it landed. Nolan took a breath and nodded. "Okay, yeah. Okay."
At 3 o'clock, he stood under the flower-covered arch and watched as Mia walked down the aisle first, scattering rose petals and grinning like she'd just won the lottery. She took her place beside him, holding Mr. Floppy in one hand and a small bouquet in the other. Then the music changed, and Celeste appeared. She was walking, slowly, with the help of her cane, but she was walking. She wore a simple white dress that fell just below her knees, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she was smiling. Nolan's throat tightened. He'd seen her at her worst. He'd seen her in pain and grief, in moments where she'd wanted to give up. But he'd never seen her like this. Radiant. Free. When she reached him, she handed the cane to Mrs. Calloway and took his hands. "Hi," she said. "Hi." The officiant started talking, but Nolan barely heard the words. He was too focused on Celeste. On the way, her hands trembled in his. On the way, her eyes stayed locked on his face, like he was the only person in the world. When it came time for the vows, Celeste went first. "I didn't think I'd ever do this again," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think I'd ever let anyone close enough to matter. But you didn't give me a choice. You just stayed. And you kept staying. And somewhere along the way, you became the person I couldn't imagine my life without. So I'm promising you this. I'm going to keep fighting. For us. For Mia. For the life we're building. And I'm never going to stop being grateful that you didn't give up on me." Nolan's vision blurred. He blinked hard and tried to pull himself together, but it was useless. "I don't have anything that good," he said, and the small crowd laughed. "But I'll try. Celeste, when I met you, I was desperate. I needed a job. I needed a place for Mia to live. I needed to survive. And you gave me that. But you also gave me something I didn't know I was missing. You gave me a reason to want more than just survival. You gave me hope and love and a family. So I'm promising you this. I'm going to show up every single day, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days. And I'm going to love you exactly as you are. No conditions, no exceptions." Celeste was crying now, and so was Mia, and honestly, so was half the garden. The officiant pronounced them married, and Nolan kissed her. It wasn't perfect. Their noses bumped, and Celeste laughed against his mouth. But it was theirs. When they pulled apart, Mia threw her arms around both of them, and the three of them stood there, holding each other, while everyone clapped. And Nolan thought, this is it. This is what happiness feels like. The reception was small and simple. They ate dinner under the lanterns, and Mia gave a speech that was mostly about how she was glad she finally had a mom again, which made Celeste cry all over again. When it came time for the first dance, Celeste hesitated. "I can't dance," she said. "Sure you can." "Nolan, I can barely walk." "Then we'll go slow." He led her to the middle of the garden, and she leaned on him, her arms around his neck. They swayed to the music, barely moving, and it was the most beautiful thing Nolan had ever been part of. "Thank you," Celeste whispered. "For what?" "For not letting me stay broken." "You were never broken. You were just healing." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "I don't know what I did to deserve you. You stayed too. That's enough." Later, after the guest had left and Mia had fallen asleep on the couch, Nolan and Celeste sat on the back porch, watching the lanterns sway in the breeze. "We did it," Celeste said. "Yeah, we did." "What happens now?" "I don't know. We keep going, I guess." She smiled. "That sounds good." They sat in comfortable silence, and Nolan thought about everything that had brought them here. The desperation, the pain, the slow, painful process of learning to trust each other. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been smooth, but it had been worth it. The months that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and adjustment. Celeste continued with her physical therapy, and by the end of summer, she could walk without the cane most days. She still had bad days, days where the pain was too much, where she needed help, where she got frustrated and angry and took it out on whoever was closest. But she was also learning to ask for help, to admit when she was struggling, to let Nolan and Mia in instead of shutting them out. Mia thrived. She made new friends at school, kids who didn't care about where she lived or how much money they had. She joined the art club and started bringing home paintings that Celeste insisted on hanging in the living room, even though they clashed with the minimalist decor, and the foundation grew. They opened a second rehabilitation center, then a third. Celeste threw herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to everything, and Nolan was right there beside her, learning as he went. One evening, about 6 months after the wedding, Nolan came home to find Celeste standing in the middle of the rehabilitation center's main hall. She wasn't using the cane, wasn't holding on to anything, just standing. "What are you doing?" he asked. She turned to him, and there were tears in her eyes. "I walked here from the parking lot by myself." Nolan's chest tightened. "Celeste, I know it's not a big deal. I know people do it every day, but Her voice broke. "I walked. All the way. And it didn't hurt." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "It's a big deal. It's a huge deal." She held on to him, shaking. "I didn't think I'd ever get here." "But you did." "We did," she corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yeah, you could have." "Maybe. But I didn't want to." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the empty hall, and Nolan thought about how far they'd both come, how much they'd both changed. He wasn't the desperate, broken man who'd shown up at her door a year and a half ago, and she wasn't the cold, isolated woman who'd tried to push everyone away. They were something new, something better. The official opening of the third rehabilitation center was scheduled for a Friday in October. It was the biggest one yet, with state-of-the-art equipment and a staff of therapists who were as passionate about the work as Celeste was. Celeste had insisted on giving the opening speech herself, and she'd spent weeks preparing. But when the day came, she was nervous. "What if I mess up?" she asked Nolan that morning. "You won't." "What if I forget what I'm supposed to say?" "Then you'll improvise. You're good at that." She gave him a look. "I hate improvising." "I know, but you'll be fine." And she was. When she stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd, her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. "3 years ago," she began, "I thought my life was over. I'd lost my daughter. I'd lost my mobility. I'd lost any sense of who I was or what I was supposed to do. And I spent a long time convinced that I didn't deserve to rebuild, that the pain I was in was some kind of punishment for not being good enough, not being strong enough, not being enough." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "But I was wrong. Pain isn't a punishment. It's just part of being human. And the people who helped me see that, my husband, my daughter, the team we've built here, they didn't fix me. They just reminded me that I was worth fighting for, that we're all worth fighting for. And that's what this place is about. It's not about fixing people. It's about giving them the tools to fight, to rebuild, to become who they're supposed to be." The applause was deafening, and when Celeste stepped down from the podium, Nolan was waiting. "You were perfect," he said. "I was okay. You were perfect." She smiled and leaned into him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making me believe it." That night, after the event was over and Mia was asleep, Nolan and Celeste sat in the living room with a bottle of wine. "We should do this more often," Celeste said. "What, drink wine? Celebrate. Take a minute to actually appreciate what we've built." Nolan looked around the room, at the drawings on the fridge, at the photos on the mantle, at the life they'd created together. "Yeah," he said, "we should." Celeste set down her glass and turned to face him. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "I'm scared." "Of what?" "That this is too good, that something's going to go wrong, that I'm going to wake up one day and realize it was all a dream." Nolan took her hand. "It's not a dream, it's real. And yeah, things are going to go wrong sometimes. That's life, but we'll deal with it, together." "You make it sound so easy." "It's not easy, but it's worth it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know what I did to deserve you. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to let me stay. That was the hardest thing I've ever done." "I know." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in the quiet, just being. And Nolan thought about the man he'd been when he first came to this house. Desperate, afraid, convinced that he'd never be enough for the people who depended on him. He wasn't that man anymore. He'd learned that being enough didn't mean being perfect. It meant showing up. It meant fighting, even when you were scared. It meant choosing the people you loved over and over again, even when it was hard. And he'd learned that love wasn't something you earned. It was something you built. One day, one choice, one moment at a time. Celeste had taught him that. So had Mia. And he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure they knew it. A year later, they were sitting in the same spot when Mia ran into the room, waving a piece of paper. Look what I got!"
Nolan took the paper. It was a report card. Straight A's. Baby, this is amazing. Mia beamed. Okay, can we get ice cream to celebrate? Absolutely, Celeste smiled. I'll get my shoes. They piled into the car and drove to the ice cream shop downtown, and Mia ordered the biggest sundae on the menu. They sat outside watching the sunset, and Nolan felt a wave of contentment wash over him. This was his life now. This messy, imperfect, beautiful life. And he wouldn't trade it for anything. Later that night, after Mia was in bed, Nolan found Celeste standing in the doorway of the room that used to be her office. She'd converted it into a small gallery filled with photos from the rehabilitation centers, letters from people they'd helped, and Mia's drawings. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different everything is now." "Good different or bad different?" "Good. Definitely good." She turned to look at him. "I was just thinking about Lily, about how much she would have loved Mia." Nolan's throat tightened. "Yeah, she would have. I used to think that moving on meant forgetting her, but it doesn't. It just means making room for more love, and I'm grateful for that." "Me too." Celeste reached for his hand. "Thank you for giving me a reason to try." "You gave me one too." They stood there hand in hand, and Nolan thought about everything they'd been through. The pain, the fear, the slow, agonizing process of learning to trust each other. And he thought about what they'd built in spite of it all. A family, a home, a life that neither of them had thought they deserved. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Years passed. Mia grew up. She went to middle school, then high school, then college. She studied art and social work, inspired by the foundation her parents had built. And when she graduated, she came back to work alongside them, helping to expand the network of rehabilitation centers across the state. Celeste's mobility continued to improve, though she still had bad days. But she'd learned to accept them, to ask for help when she needed it, to let Nolan and Mia carry her when she couldn't carry herself. And Nolan, who'd once thought he'd never be more than a man struggling to survive, became a leader in the accessibility advocacy space. He spoke at conferences, he wrote articles, he helped shape policy. But more than that, he became the kind of father and husband he'd always wanted to be, present, reliable, loving. One evening, when Mia was home for the holidays, the three of them sat in the living room looking through old photos. "Look at this one," Mia said, holding up a picture from the day of the wedding. "You both look so young." "We were young," Celeste said. "You're still young," Nolan countered. Celeste laughed. "Speak for yourself." Mia set down the photo and looked at them. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret it? Any of it?" Nolan and Celeste exchanged a look. "No?" Celeste said. "Not for a second." "Me neither," Nolan added. Mia smiled. "Good, because I don't either." She got up and hugged them both, and Nolan felt the familiar warmth settle in his chest. The warmth that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, Nolan and Celeste stood on the back porch, looking out at the garden where they'd been married all those years ago. "We did okay, didn't we?" Celeste said. "Better than okay." "You think Mia's happy?" "I think she's more than happy. I think she's whole." Celeste leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted." "Me too." They stood there in the quiet, and Nolan thought about the eviction notice that had started it all. The desperation, the fear. The moment he decided to take a job working for a woman everyone said was impossible, he thought about how close he'd come to giving up, how many times he'd wanted to walk away. And he thought about how glad he was that he hadn't. Because sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when you're too stubborn to quit. When you show up, even when it's hard. When you choose to stay, even when leaving would be easier. That's what love is, Nolan had learned. Not some grand gesture or perfect moment, just the quiet, everyday choice to keep fighting, to keep showing up, to keep building something worth holding on to. And he and Celeste and Mia, they'd built something beautiful. Not perfect, but real. And real was always better than perfect anyway.